The Night of Ascension was the most important ceremony in Volanti culture, a ritual that had been performed unchanged for 8,000 years to formally name the heir to the throne. Every noble family was required to attend, and the great hall of the Palace of Stars was filled with the most powerful beings on the planet. Queen Alindra sat upon her crystal throne with her daughters arranged behind her, and Princess Seraphel wore robes of woven light that marked her as the chosen. Successor Minho stood in the shadows at the edge of the chamber, watching everything and trusting nothing. He had spent the entire night preparing for this moment, coordinating with the small human security team from the embassy and placing them at strategic points. Throughout the palace, the Volanti guards had been offended by the implication that they could not protect their own ceremony. But the queen had overruled their objections. "We know they are coming," she had told Minho in their final meeting before the ceremony, "but we do not know how many or from which direction." "It does not matter," Minho had replied. "I will stop them." "You cannot stop an army by yourself. Watch me." Now he stood in the darkness and waited while the ceremony proceeded through its ancient ritual. Seraphel spoke the words that had been spoken by heirs for millennia, pledging herself to the service of her people and the protection of her realm. Minho thought it was ironic that she spoke of protection while relying on a human to keep her alive. The attack came just as the ceremony reached its climax. The main doors exploded. Inward and Krorath soldiers poured into the chamber, their weapons already firing into the crowd of screaming nobles. At the same moment, a group of Volanti guards turned their weapons on their fellows, the traitors finally revealing themselves in the chaos. Minho was moving. Before the dust had settled, he cut through the first wave of Krorath soldiers like a blade through silk, his weapon spitting fire in precise bursts that dropped one enemy after another. A Volanti traitor tried to reach Seraphel, and Minho put 3 shots through his chest without breaking stride. The screams of the nobles mixed with the shouts of soldiers and the crack of energy weapons, and in the middle of it all was one human moving with a purpose that bordered on madness. A Krorath captain saw him and recognized the threat, directing a squad to focus their fire on the single most dangerous target in the room. Minho took a hit to his left arm and kept moving. He took a hit to his leg and kept moving. He took a hit to his side that reopened his old wound, and still he kept moving. Because stopping meant Seraphel would die, and that was not acceptable. The other human security team members were fighting their own battles throughout the palace, holding choke points and buying time for the royal family to be evacuated. But Minho would not leave. He had sworn to protect the princess, and he would protect her until his body physically could not move anymore. A Krorath soldier got close enough to engage him in hand-to-hand combat, and Minho broke his arm in 2 places before putting a knife through his throat. Another soldier tried to flank him, and Minho shot him without looking, his instincts guiding his aim with supernatural precision. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead, and his left arm hung nearly useless at his side, and every breath felt like fire in his lungs. But he kept fighting. The Volanti survivors who witnessed what happened that night would speak of it for generations. They would describe a human who smiled through pain, who laughed in the face of death, who moved like a demon made flesh and fought with a ferocity that defied comprehension. They would say he killed 20 enemies or 40 or 100. And the truth was that even Minho did not know the real number. He only knew that anyone who came near Seraphel died, and anyone who threatened the queen died, and anyone who stood between him and his duty died. The battle lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, the floor of the great hall was covered with bodies, and Minho stood in the center of the carnage like a statue carved from blood and determination. The Krorath soldiers who had survived the initial assault retreated, dragging their wounded with them, and spreading word of what they had faced. A single human had broken their attack. A single human had held The line when everyone else fell, Minho collapsed 3 seconds after the last enemy fled, his body finally surrendering to the damage it had sustained. Serafel was at his side before he hit the ground, her elegant hands pressing against his wounds while she shouted for medical assistance. "You are insane," she said, and there were tears running down her face. "You could have died. You should have died. No one survives injuries like this. Humans are stubborn." Minho managed to say, "You are more than stubborn. You are impossible." Queen Alindra appeared beside them, her robe stained with blood that was not her own. She had fought too, Minho realized, had picked up a weapon and defended herself when her guards fell. "Get him to the healers," she commanded. "Use everything we have. And if that is not enough, send for the best physicians on Earth." The following days passed in a haze of pain and recovery. Minho drifted in and out of consciousness while doctors from 2 species worked to repair damage that should have been fatal. He woke to find Serafel sitting beside his bed every single time, her silver eyes watching him with an expression that he was only now beginning to understand. "The Kroth Dominion has withdrawn from our borders," she told him when he was finally coherent enough to listen. "They saw the footage of what you did, and their fleet turned around without firing a single shot. That seems like an overreaction. They asked our intelligence service if you were representative of your species." Serafel said, "We told them, yes." Minho laughed and then groaned as his wounds protested. "You lied to them." "Perhaps," Serafel admitted, "but perhaps not, because my mother has been talking to your government about a military alliance, and they have agreed to station a battalion of human soldiers on our world. That is a big step for a species that considered us barely civilized. That was before we saw what you would do for us." Serafel said, "My mother told the council that any species that produces warriors like you is not one she wishes to face as an enemy." She paused. "She also said you are exactly the kind she wants as a friend." Queen Alindra visited later that day and performed a ceremony that had never been performed for an outsider in the entire history of the Volanti Empire. She named Minho Guardian of the Blood Royal, a title that made him a permanent protector of the royal family and a member of her household. "You have earned this and more," she said. "Your people will always have a friend among the Volanti." After she left, Serafel remained. "I asked you a question before the attack in the gardens," she said. "You never answered it." Minho remembered she had asked if noticing things about her was just part of his job. "It started as part of my job," he admitted. "And now?" "Now I think I would notice you even if it was not my job," he said. "Even if I was not a princess?" "Especially if you were not a princess," Serafel smiled. "And it was the most beautiful thing Minho had ever seen among my people. Relationships take centuries to develop," she said. "That is a long time to wait." "Then perhaps we should not wait," Serafel said. "Perhaps we should learn to care faster, like humans do." Minho reached out and took her hand, and they sat together in comfortable silence while the sun set over a world that had been changed forever by the actions of one stubborn human who refused to let anyone he cared about come to harm outside the window. The first human military transport was descending through the atmosphere, carrying soldiers who would become the foundation of an alliance that would reshape galactic politics for centuries to come. And it had all started because a single human had seen someone in danger and had moved without thinking. Because that was what humans did, and what humans would always do. They protected people. It was as simple and as profound as that. The announcement that a human would serve as Princess Serafel's personal guardian caused a kind of scandal that the Volanti court had not seen in 300 years. Nobles who had not spoken a harsh word in decades suddenly found their voices, and the halls of the palace echoed with a protests and demands for explanation Queen Alindra ignored. Them all with the practiced ease of someone who had been ruling longer than most of her critics had been. Alive Minho stood beside Seraphal's throne during her first public appearance since the assassination attempt, wearing armor that the human embassy had rushed to supply and carrying weapons that made the Volanti guards nervous. He looked like what he was, a soldier ready for war in a court that had forgotten what war looked like. "They hate you," Seraphel murmured without moving her lips, a skill that royalty apparently learned young. "They have hated me since I arrived on this planet." Minho replied in the same fashion. "This is not new. It is different now because you are supposed to be invisible, and instead you are standing next to the throne like you belong there. Do you want me to leave?" Seraphel was quiet for a moment. "No," she said finally. "I find that I feel safer with you here, which is strange because I should not need protection from my own people. The people who want you dead are not your people." Minho said, "They are traitors wearing familiar faces." A noble approached the throne to pay his respects, and Minho watched him the way a hawk watches a mouse. The noble's hands trembled slightly as he bowed, and his eyes kept darting to the human standing guard. When he retreated, he moved faster than protocol demanded. "You terrify them," Seraphel observed. "Good. Why is that good?" "Because fear makes people cautious," Minho explained. "And cautious people make mistakes that reveal their true intentions." Over the following days, Minho became Seraphal's shadow, present at every meal and every meeting and every moment of her public life. He learned the rhythms of the Volanti court, learned to read the subtle expressions that passed for emotion among these controlled beings, and he began to notice patterns. Certain nobles always seemed to be watching, always seemed to position themselves where they could observe without being observed. Messages passed in glances and gestures that Minho cataloged and reported to the queen. "You see things my own intelligence network missed," Alindra said during one of their private meetings. "Your people are too elegant." Minho replied, "They look for elegant conspiracies with elegant evidence. But conspiracies are messy by nature, and humans understand messy. Humans invented messy." Alindra laughed, a sound like crystal bells that Minho had never heard from her before. "I am beginning to understand why my ancestors decided to avoid your species," she said. "You are too unpredictable." "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," Alindra said. "My ancestors valued order above all things, and humans are agents of chaos." She handed him a data crystal containing the latest intelligence reports. "The Krorath Dominion has been massing ships along our border," she said. "They claim it is routine military exercises, but my analysts believe they are preparing for invasion." "How soon?" "Weeks at most, perhaps days." "And the traitors in your court?" "We have identified most of them, but we cannot move against them without proof," Alindra said. "If we arrest nobles based on suspicion alone, we risk civil war, so we wait for them to make their move." "We wait," Alindra confirmed. "But when they move, I want you ready." Minho nodded and returned to his duties. That night, Seraphel asked him to stay while she walked in the floating gardens, and they talked as they had begun to do whenever they were alone. "Do you miss Earth?" she asked. "Sometimes," Minho admitted. "I miss the weight of real gravity and the smell of rain on concrete and the sound of people laughing without restraint." "We do not laugh the way you do," Seraphel said. "Our emotions are more controlled." "I noticed." "Does it bother you?" Minho considered the question. "It makes you harder to read," he said. "But I am learning." "What have you learned?" "That underneath all that control, you feel things just as deeply as we do." Minho said, "You just do not show it the same way." Seraphel stopped walking and looked at him with an expression that was almost surprise. "No one has ever said that to me before," she said. No one has ever told you that you have feelings? No one outside my immediate family has ever looked closely enough to notice. They stood in silence, surrounded by flowers that glowed with bioluminescence. And Minho realized that for all her centuries of life, there was something lonely about this princess that reminded him of himself. I notice things, he said. It is part of my job. Is that the only reason? Before Minho could answer, his instinct screamed a warning. He grabbed Seraphel and threw them both to the ground as energy beams cut through the air. Where they had been standing, 3 assassins emerged from the shadows, moving with military precision that identified them as cross special forces rather than Volanthi traitors. Minho rolled to his feet with his weapon already firing, and the first assassin fell with a scream that echoed across the gardens. The second and third split up to flank him, and Minho made a calculation in a fraction of a second. He could not protect Seraphel and fight them both at the same time. Run, he told her. I will not leave you. That was not a request. He pushed her toward the palace and turned to face the remaining assassins with nothing but his weapon and his training and his absolute refusal to fail. The fight lasted 12 seconds when the palace guards finally arrived. They found Minho standing over 2 bodies with blood running from a cut on his forehead and fire in his eyes. Arafel had not run. She had hidden behind a crystalline tree and watched the entire thing. Watched a human move with speed that should have been impossible and fight with a ferocity that her people had never witnessed. They were Krorath, Minho said to the guard captain, which means the invasion is about to begin. He looked at Seraphel. We need to get you to the palace immediately. The night of ascension ceremony is tomorrow, she said. I am supposed to be named heir in front of the entire court. Then that is when they will strike. Minho said with absolute certainty. The traitors will make their move during the ceremony because that is when all their targets will be in one place. He contacted the queen through his communicator. Your Majesty, we need to talk, he said. The time for waiting is over, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the Volanthi border, a fleet of Krorath warships began their final approach, carrying soldiers who had been told that the conquest would be easy. They had no idea what was waiting for them. They had never faced a human with something to protect. The Palace of Healing was a place of quiet light and soft sounds, where injured Volanthi were tended by physicians who had studied their art for centuries. Minho was the first human to ever lie in one of its beds, and the staff treated him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disgust, but they followed their queen's orders. And human doctors from the embassy were allowed to come and go as they pleased. Dr. Sarah Park had been treating Minho for 3 days, and she still could not believe he was alive. The energy weapon should have killed you, she said as she changed his bandages. It burned through muscle and damaged 2 organs. And you kept fighting for another 30 seconds after being hit. Adrenaline, Minho replied. Human stubbornness. Park corrected. Same thing. The door to his chamber slid open and a figure entered wearing a hooded cloak that concealed her features. Minho's hand moved toward the weapon he no longer had before he recognized the way she moved. Princess. He said. Seraphel removed her hood and looked at him with those silver eyes that seemed to hold questions she did not know how to ask. I should not be here, she said. The court would be scandalized if they knew I visited a human alone. Then why are you here? Seraphel moved closer and sat in a chair beside his bed, her movements uncertain in a way that seemed foreign to her elegant species. I have been trying to understand, she said. Understand what? You, she said. What you did and why you did it. Minho shifted to face her better and winced as his wound protested. I thought that would be obvious. Nothing about it is obvious to me, Seraphel replied. I have lived for 200 years and I have never seen anyone act the way you acted. And I have certainly never seen anyone risk their life for a stranger without hesitation or expectation of reward. Where I come from, That is called being a decent person. Seraphel shook her head slowly. Among my people, such behavior would only occur between family members who had known each other for centuries. And even then there would be calculation involved. That sounds lonely. I never thought of it that way before. Seraphel admitted, but perhaps it is. They sat in silence for a moment while Dr. Park pretended to organize medical supplies and definitely was not listening to every word. Can I ask you something? Seraphel said, You just did, but go ahead. When you saw the assassin, what did you think? Minho considered the question carefully because he wanted to give her an honest answer. I did not think, he said. That is the truth of it. And I know it sounds strange, but there was no thought involved at all. How is that possible? Humans have something called instinct, Minho explained. It is programming built into our bodies from millions of years of evolution. And one of our strongest instincts is to protect people who are in danger. Even strangers? Especially strangers, Minho said. When I was a child, I saw a news story about a man who jumped into a frozen river to save a stranger's baby. And he died doing it because the cold stopped his heart. But he got the baby to shore first. That is insane, Seraphel said. But her voice held wonder rather than judgment. That is human, Minho replied. We cannot help what we are. And what we are is a species that protects. Seraphel leaned back in a chair and studied him like he was a puzzle she desperately wanted to solve. My mother has been investigating your species, she said. She has had her intelligence network gathering information about human history and culture for 3 days now. Should I be worried about that? I do not know, Seraphel admitted. She has not told me what she has found. But I have never seen her so focused on anything. The door opened again, and this time it was Queen Alindra herself who entered. Moving with the effortless grace that marked her, kind Dr. Park immediately bowed, and then made herself scarce. And Seraphel rose to greet her mother with formal respect. Leave us. Alindra said to her daughter, I wish to speak with the human alone. Seraphel looked like she wanted to argue, but thought better of it. She glanced at Minho one more time before departing. And he thought he saw concern in her eyes. Your species is fascinating, Alindra said once they were alone. I am going to assume that is not entirely a compliment. Alindra smiled that slight smile that seemed to be the Volanthi equivalent of laughter. My intelligence network has compiled a report on humanity, she said. It contains your history, your wars, your philosophies, and your patterns of behavior across 300 years of recorded space travel. That must have made for interesting reading, terrifying reading. Alindra corrected. Your species has been traveling among the stars for less than 4 centuries. And in that time you have fought 47 wars against other species and won 43 of them. We do not start fights, Minho said, but we finish them. That is precisely what frightens me. Alindra replied, but what frightens me more is what I learned about why you fight. She moved to the window and looked out over the floating gardens. Every species in the galaxy fights for resources or territory or survival. She continued, your species fights for those things too. But you also fight for something else, something that none of my analysts can fully understand. And what is that? Alindra turned to face him. You fight for strangers, she said. You fight for people you have never met and will never meet. For abstract concepts like justice and freedom and protection of the innocent. Is that strange? It is unprecedented, Alindra said. Every other species we have encountered fights for themselves and their immediate family. And that is understandable because that is logical. Humans have never been very good at logic. No, Alindra agreed. You are good at something else. Entirely, she approached his bed and looked down at him with those ancient eyes. The assassination attempt on my daughter was not random, she said. There is a conspiracy within my own court. Nobles who have allied with the Kroth Dominion to overthrow my rule. I am sorry to hear that. I have suspected for some time, but have not been able to identify all the traitors. Elendra continued, I also cannot trust my own guards, because any of them might be compromised. Minho began to see where this was going. You want me to protect your daughter. I want you to do what you already proved you will do without hesitation. Elendra said, I want you to be what you are, which is a guardian. The court will never accept a human in that role. The court will accept what I tell them to accept. Elendra replied with a flash of iron beneath her elegant exterior, but I need to know. That you are willing, Minho thought. About it for exactly 2 seconds, I am willing. He said, but you should know that human protection comes with human methods. And when the next attack comes, I will not be elegant or restrained. Elendra nodded. Slowly, that is precisely what I am counting on, she said. Let them see what a human does to those who threaten what he has sworn to protect. She turned to leave but paused at the door. Recover quickly. Sergeant Kang, she said. I have a feeling we do not have much time. After she left, Minho lay in the healing bed and stared at the crystal ceiling and wondered how a simple soldier had ended up becoming the guardian of alien royalty, but deep down, he knew the answer was simple. He was human, and humans protected people. It was what they did. It was what they had always done. It was what they would continue to do until the stars themselves burned out. The Hall of Ancestors was the oldest structure on the Volanthi homeworld. A vast chamber carved from a single piece of living crystal that had been growing for 20,000 years. The walls were lined with alcoves containing the preserved remains of every ruler who had ever sat upon the throne, their bodies transformed into statues of pure light that watched the proceedings with empty eyes. Minho was brought before the High Council in chains that burned wherever they touched his skin. A security measure designed for criminals, far more dangerous than a wounded human soldier. The council sat upon elevated platforms arranged in a semicircle. 12 ancient Volanthi whose combined age exceeded 10,000 years. They looked at Minho the way a scientist might look at a particularly interesting insect. The human will stand and hear the charges against him, the chief counselor announced in a voice that echoed through the chamber like thunder. Minho stood because he refused to show weakness before these creatures who had decided he deserved death for saving a life. His wounds screamed in protest, but he kept his face blank. On the sacred day of the Festival of Quiet Stars, you did willfully and with full knowledge commit violence within sight of the royal procession. The chief counselor continued, you did spill blood upon consecrated ground, and you did discharge weapons of war during a time of holy peace. I stopped assassins from killing your princess, Minho said, and his voice was steady despite the pain. That is not relevant to these proceedings. It should be. The council stirred with displeasure at his interruption, but the chief counselor raised a hand for silence. The law is the law, human, and it has stood unchanged for 10,000 years because it is perfect and absolute. Your perfect law would have let an innocent woman die. If the gods had willed her survival, she would have survived without your interference. Minho wanted to laugh at the absurdity of this reasoning, but he held it back because laughter would not help him now. Do you have anything else to say in your defense? The chief counselor asked, and it was clear from his tone that he expected nothing. Minho thought about making a speech, about explaining that where he came from a person did not stand by while innocents were murdered regardless of what day it was. But these beings would not understand because they had never been prey, had never evolved on a world where death came from every direction and survival meant protecting your own. I saw a threat, Minho said simply. I responded. And you do not regret your actions? I regret that I was not fast enough to avoid getting shot. The council muttered among themselves in their musical language, and Minho caught words like primitive and typical and expected nothing more. The sentence for your crime is death by dissolution, the chief counselor announced. Your body will be broken down into its component atoms and scattered across the void between stars so that no trace of your violation remains upon our sacred world. Minho nodded, because he had expected this. When? The sentence will be carried out at the next moonrise, which gives you approximately 12 hours to make peace with whatever gods your species worships. The guards moved forward to take him back to his cell, and Minho let them because there was nothing else to do. He glanced up at the royal gallery where Princess Seraphil sat watching the proceedings with an expression he could not read. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Minho thought he saw something there. Something that might have been guilt or confusion or the beginning of understanding. Then the guards pulled him away, and the moment was gone. He was halfway to the door when everything changed. Stop. The voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority, and every being in the chamber froze as if turned to stone. Queen Alindra descended from her private viewing platform on a column of light, her robes flowing around her like water. Given form, she was ancient beyond Minho's comprehension. Over 600 years old, and still beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. Power radiated from her like heat from a sun. My queen, the chief counselor said, and for the first time there was uncertainty in his voice. You have not attended a trial in 300 years. I have not had reason to attend, Alindra replied. Today I have reason. She walked across the chamber floor with steps that made no sound, and the crowd parted before her like grass bending. The four Winchi stopped in front of Minho and looked at him with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. You saved my daughter's life, she said. Yes, you knew you would likely die for it. I suspected, and yet you acted. Anyway, Minho met her gaze without flinching, because he had faced death too many times to be afraid of a look. That is what humans do. Alindra studied him for a long moment, and Minho had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing things about him that he did not know himself. Interesting, she said at last. My queen, the chief counselor interrupted. The law is clear, and even you cannot change what has been written for 10,000 years. I do not intend to change the law, Alindra said, and there was a hint of amusement in her ancient voice. I intend to invoke a law that is even older. The council stirred with confusion and alarm. The debt of blood, Alindra continued. When a life is saved, the saved and the savior become bound until the debt is repaid, and the savior cannot be harmed until that bond is satisfied. That law has not been used in 5,000 years. The chief counselor protested. The law does not expire simply because it is not used. Alindra replied, my daughter's life belongs to the crown, and this human saved that life, which means his life now belongs to me until I release him. She turned to face the council with an expression that dared them to challenge her, unless you wish to argue that the ancient laws are no longer valid, in which case we should discuss which other laws might need to be reconsidered. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and the council members exchanged glances that spoke of calculations and reconsiderations. The Queen's interpretation is correct, the chief counselor said finally, and his voice was tight with suppressed anger. The human sentence is suspended until the debt of blood is satisfied. Alindra nodded as if she had expected nothing else. Take him to the Palace of Healing and summon the human physicians from their embassy, she commanded. He will be treated with the respect owed to one who carries a royal debt. As the guards removed his burning chains, Minho looked at the Queen and tried to understand what had just happened. Why? The Ascad Alindra smiled, and it was the first genuine expression he had seen from a Volanti since arriving on this world. Because I am curious, she said, "and because I have not been surprised by anything in a very long time." She turned and walked away, leaving Minho to wonder what he had gotten himself into and whether survival might prove more complicated than death. The Volanthi homeworld was a place of impossible beauty, a planet where crystalline towers reached toward purple. Skies and gardens floated on currents of magnetic energy that humans could barely understand, Sergeant. Minho Kang had been stationed here for 3 months as part of a small security detail attached to the human embassy, and he still could not get used to the way everything seemed to glow with inner light. The Volanthi themselves were tall and slender, their skin pale blue and their eyes like liquid silver, and they moved through their world with a grace that made humans look clumsy by comparison. They had been part of galactic civilization for 10,000 years, and they looked at humanity the way a scholar might look at a child just learning to read. Minho did not mind their condescension because he had not come here to make friends. He had come here to do his job, and his job today was to stand at the edge of a ceremonial procession and look intimidating, while diplomats exchanged words that meant nothing. Festival of Quiet Stars was the most sacred day in the Volanthi calendar, a time when the royal family walked among their people in a show of unity and blessing. Queen Alindra herself led the procession, her robes trailing behind her like captured starlight, and behind her walked her 3 daughters in order of age. Princess Seraphel was the youngest, barely 200 years old by Volanthi counting, which made her practically an infant by their standards. Minho watched her pass and thought she looked bored beneath her ceremonial mask of serenity. The crowd pressed close on both sides, thousands of Volanthi citizens reaching out to touch the air where their rulers had passed, as if they could capture some of their essence. Minho kept his eyes moving because that was what he had been trained to do, and his training had kept him alive through 3 colonial conflicts and 1 border war. Something was wrong. He could not say what it was at first because everything looked normal on the surface, but there was a pattern in the crowd that did not fit 3 figures moving against the flow of bodies, their movements too sharp and purposeful for worshippers. Lost in religious ecstasy, Minho was already moving before his conscious mind caught up with his instincts. The first assassin raised a weapon that looked like a crystal wand, and energy gathered at its tip in a spiral of deadly light. The Volanthi guards stood frozen because violence during the festival was unthinkable, a violation of everything they held sacred, and their minds simply could not process what they were seeing. Minho processed it just fine. He crossed the distance in 3 strides and threw himself between the weapon and Princess Seraphel. Just as it discharged, the energy bolt hit him in the side, and it felt like someone had pressed the sun against his ribs. Did not stop moving. His sidearm was in his hand, and he fired twice, and the first assassin fell with a hole in his chest where his heart used to beat. Second assassin tried to bring his weapon around, but Minho was faster. Always faster, because humans had evolved on a world where hesitation meant death. 2 more shots, and the second assassin crumpled. The third one ran, and Minho considered pursuit for half a second before his legs gave out beneath him. The pain hit him all at once, a wave of agony that turned his vision white and filled his mouth with the taste of copper. He could hear screaming in languages he did not understand, could feel hands on his body trying to move him, but it all seemed very far away. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Princess Seraphel staring down at him with those silver eyes, and he thought she looked confused more than grateful. When Minho woke, he was in a cell. The walls were made of the same crystal that seemed to form everything on this world, and they hummed with energy that made his teeth ache. His side had been bandaged but not healed, and every breath sent fire through his chest. A Volanthi guard stood outside the cell with an expression of pure disgust on his alien features. "The human is awake," the guard announced to someone Minho could not see. Ambassador Chun appeared a moment later, her face tight with barely controlled anger. "Sergeant Kang, how do you feel?" "Like I got shot," Minho replied, and the effort of speaking made him want to vomit. "You saved the princess's life," Chun said, and her voice carried a warning that Minho did not understand. "That is my job." "Ma'am, the Volanti do not see it that way," Chun continued. And now Minho could hear the fear beneath her professional calm. "You spill blood during their most sacred ceremony, and their law does not care about intent or circumstance." Minho processed this information slowly because the pain made thinking difficult. What does their law care about? "Punishment," Chun said. "They have sentenced you to death." The word should have shocked him. But Minho found that he felt nothing at all. He had known from the moment he saw those assassins that he was probably going to die. And he had made his choice anyway. "Can you get me out?" Chun shook her head, and her eyes were wet. "I have tried everything. But their law is absolute, and they will not bend it for a human. They would let their princes die rather than forgive the man who saved her. They believe the gods would have protected her if it was meant to be," Chun said. And the bitterness in her voice could have etched glass. Human intervention was a violation of divine will. Minho laughed, and the pain nearly made him pass out. "That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. Be that as it may, you will face the High Council tomorrow, and they will confirm your sentence." Chun reached through the energy barrier and squeezed his hand. "I am sorry, Minho, and I want you to know that Earth will remember what you did here. Will remembering bring me back to life?" Chun had no answer for that. After she left, Minho lay in the dark and thought about his family back on Earth. His mother who had begged him not to join the military, and his sister who had cried at his graduation. He thought about all the things he would never do and all the places he would never see, but mostly he thought about that moment when he had seen the weapon pointed at the princess and had not hesitated. He had not thought about reward or consequence or survival. He had simply moved because that was who he was and who he had always been, a protector, a guardian, a human being in a galaxy that did not value human beings at all if he had to die for being what he was. Then at least he would die without regret. The crystal walls hummed around him, and somewhere in the palace above, a princess was learning that her life had been purchased with the blood of a species her people considered barely more than animals. Minho closed his eyes and waited for tomorrow to come.